Christian parenting.
Well, welcome to the Journey Podcast. My name is Jonathan Pitts, and I am your host. You may or may not know who I am, so I'm just going to, at the beginning of my podcast here, just explain a little bit about myself. But I'm a pastor in Franklin, Tennessee, which is a suburb of Nashville. I've been pastoring here. I'm an executive pastor at a church called Church of the City. We're a family of 5 churches in the Nashville area, and I've had the privilege of being the executive pastor here for 2 years. But I've been in executive leadership for about 15 years in Christian entertainment and teaching ministries, nonprofits, and have just been on this journey of God just using me in the way that He's wanted to use me. I am a widow. I've been a widow for a little more than 2 years now, and I'm a dad to 4 girls, which is why I find myself doing this podcast with Christian parenting, which I'm really excited about. And I'm just a guy that God has worked in my life to the point where, for whatever reason, He's decided to put my story on display, to put my journey on display. And I'm a guy that's just decided to own my story, every single bit of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I created this podcast because I want you to do the same. I want you to own your story. I want you to understand your story. And I want you just to really get excited about what God might be doing in your life through the good, the bad, and the ugly. And, the verse of my life right now is Philippians 4:8, which Paul says, whatever is true and honorable, right and pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, or praiseworthy, to think on these things. And so as I've journeyed, as I've lived this life, I've had a lot of things happen in my life. And the thing that I'm trying to do the most right now is to think about what's right and true and honorable and pure and lovely and admirable and excellent. And to the degree that I can do those things is to the degree that I can actually see God working in my story in all those different areas. And so the thing that I want to do with you right now is just share my story, just a bit of my story and how I got to where I am so that you can actually see maybe where you are in yours. And there's a quote that I love by a guy named Curt Thompson. Curt is a Christian psychologist, wrote a book called The Soul of Shame. And in that book, he says, and listen up, parents, this is for you. This is a great quote if you're a parent listening to this podcast right now. He says, to the degree that a parent makes sense of their own story will be to the degree that a child can be secure in theirs. To the degree that a parent makes sense of their own story will be to the degree that a child can be secure in theirs. And that is not only true in parenting, it's definitely true in parenting. And I want to own my story so that my daughters can own theirs. But it's also true in life for all of us. We have people that are looking to our lives and looking to us as leaders. And when we own our story, they can own their story. So I want you to think about, as you listen to this podcast, as you hear my story, as you think about your own story, I honestly want you to be thinking about not only owning your own story, but also owning your story so that others around you, your children mainly, but then those that are around you otherwise, organizations you lead or influence you might have, that you can be in a place to help them understand their story as well. The reality is that reality is not easy for all of us, or most of us, or any of us. Reality is hard. We have, like I said, good, bad, and ugly. And I want to share my story, and I want to help you understand in yours how not ignoring your reality, but not limiting that reality either is important. So when I say that, I think back to Philippians 4:8. Yes, it's true. I'm a widow, and I'm going to tell my story about how I lost my wife of 15 years and 27 days. I'm going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of grieving with young girls. I'm going to talk about mistakes I've made. I'm going to go into all of it because the reality is that us owning our story, all of it, not limiting it, is the only way to move forward when we make mistakes or when we have hardships. So when I say that, what I mean is, even in the bad and the ugly, God is still working, and He's still weaving golden strands through your story, and you have to choose to see it. Philippians 4:8, whatever is true, honorable, right, and pure, lovely, and admirable. If anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think on these things. That means those things always exist. When Paul says that, those things exist. So you can actually lean on that truth, that there's always going to be right, true, honorable, pure, lovely, admirable, and excellent things that you can think about and praise God for. So there's a continuation of that quote. He goes on to say, of all the variables that encourage the development of secure attachment in a child, the single most powerful one is the degree to which the child's parent has made coherent sense of his or her own story. And that's what I'm attempting to do, I think, on this podcast is, and really in life, these last 2 years since losing my wife, there's been a lot of things that don't make sense. And so I've been on this journey of seeking to make sense out of all of it. And my hope is that in me sharing my story, that you can be doing the same thing, that you can be taking your cues from me to a degree, taking your cues from what God might be teaching you. Even as a parent, I'm sure you guys are walking through things. Could be the loss of a child, could be the loss of a spouse, could be sickness in your family, could be financial hardship. The thing that I've come to realize is that in this life, the things that we go through that are hard, it's typically, when we think about loss, it's unmet expectations. So when I lost my wife, I had an expectation that I would be married to her for several decades. I thought I'd be married to her for 50 or 60 years or something like that, or that was at least my hope. And the reality is I didn't get that. And so I had, my expectations were off. And that's true of a lot of things. That's jobs we have that we lose. That's true of, like all kinds of different circumstances. And so I would say that loss is loss is loss, and grief is grief is grief. And so as we journey together and as we have these conversations, I want you to be thinking about how you can make coherent sense of your loss, of the expectations you had that haven't been met. And we're going to do that together. So I'm looking forward to just sharing some with you. And so what I'd love to do is just share a little bit about my story. What's funny is I've always been in the backgrounds. I've been like a number two kind of guy, always in the backgrounds of mostly ministries that I've worked in. Right now, I work at a church called Church of the City, like I mentioned. But in addition to that, I worked for a guy named Tony Evans, Dr. Tony Evans. Many of you may know him and know his ministry. And I was the executive for his national ministry for about 7 years. Prior to that, I actually worked with his son, Anthony, who's an amazing artist, an amazingly gifted singer, and a really good friend of mine to this day who's walked with me through my grief. We're actually going to get an opportunity to talk to him in this podcast as well. And he walked with me really closely. But I've been, really behind the scenes for the majority of 15 years of career that I've had. And one day, God decided to make my story really public and put me in a really public place. I don't know why he did that, but he did. And that's where I find myself now, even with this podcast and sharing my story. But it all started, my life started longer ago than 2 years, but really it all started on July 24th, 2018, when my wife, Wynter Danielle Pitts, suddenly died in my arms unexpectedly. Just to tell you a little bit about Wynter, Wynter was my wife of 15 years and 27 days, but more than that, Wynter was an incredible woman of vision and was a girl that just had big dreams. When we were 21 years old, I remember we were dating at the time, Wynter said, "I want to write a book." And I said, "Well, what do you want to write a book about?" And she said, "Well, I want to write a book about, I don't know. I don't have an idea for that. I just want to write a book." And I said, "Well, you might want to figure that out. You might want to figure out what your book's about before you start telling people you want to write a book." And what's really funny about that is I would say almost about 10 years into marriage, more like 8 years into marriage, Wynter would discover what that book was going to be about. Because at that point in our life, we had 4 girls that we were raising. And Wynter discovered that there was an opportunity for her to begin helping create content for tween girls. Our oldest daughter at the time was about 7 years old, and she was read at a really high level, but the things that Wynter wanted to give her in terms of books or magazines just weren't appropriate. And so Wynter decided one day to download a free copy of Adobe InDesign and started to create a little resource that would become a magazine called For Girls Like You magazine. Creating For Girls Like You magazine would lead to Wynter publishing several books. I think at this point she's up somewhere north of 15 different books and resources for girls, including devotionals and trade books and coloring books and different things. And so Wynter was a girl who lived the purposes of God. Acts 13:36 says that David served the purposes of God for his generation, and then he fell asleep. And I love that verse because it's just this verse that's a reminder to us as believers. I don't know if you're a believer, listen to this podcast, but what we believe as Christians is that we will serve the purposes that God gives us in this life, that God's given us a very specific purpose. And if we follow him, that we will serve that purpose. And Wynter was a girl who served the purposes that God had given her in life. And then one day she fell asleep. We were actually in the middle of a move. I was coming here to pastor in Tennessee. We had bought our house in Tennessee. We had moved from Dallas on July 10th, 2018. We bought our house and we moved in, and we left for about 2 weeks to do a vacation, and then I had to finish up my last week of work in Dallas. And while we were in Dallas, Wynter laid down for a nap, and she actually told me that night, she said, "I have to finish this book." She was working on a book called I Am Yours, Prayers for God's Girls, ironically. And she said, "I really need your help to get this book done." And so I came home from work that night, really excited about digging in with my girls and just being a dad that's on. If you're a dad listening to this podcast, you know what it means to just step in, or a mom that knows what it means to step in when your spouse is exhausted. And so I was coming home ready to step in, and Wynter decided to lay down and take a nap. And I would fix dinner for my girls, and then I would go into the bedroom to actually floss my teeth because we had ribs for dinner. And when I went into the bedroom, what I would discover is that Wynter was having some sort of cardiac event where her heart stopped. I thought she was having a seizure. Honestly, didn't really know exactly what was happening, but I do know that the most difficult day of my life and the most difficult moments of my life were happening right then. By God's grace, what it really was cardiac dysrhythmia, where her heart got off, and what would happen is her oxygen would stop going to her brain, and she would have passed out slowly and would have glided into eternity. And so that's what she did. It was an unbelievably difficult time. I mean, everything you can think about, the panic, the stress, the darkness, the fear, the prayers that were going up, all of it was really incredibly difficult. And on that day, I lost my best friend. On that day, my 4 girls lost their mom. And on that day, the world lost a spiritual giant that was doing massive things for the kingdom. In all ways, Wynter was on the rise. Her publishing career was growing. Her magazine was growing. And we seemingly had an amazing journey in front of us. But on that day, I would find myself looking my girls in the eyes and having to explain to them that their mommy had gone to eternity. And that was the hardest task I've had to this date. It's really interesting how I had pretty clear thoughts in the moment. And the thing that I knew I needed to do, or the responsibility I knew I needed to own the most, was getting my girls through that moment, getting my girls through that evening. I mean, it was about 7 o'clock, maybe when we got to the 7:30, maybe when we got to the hospital. And by the time Wynter had passed away, I mean, it was just lots happening, lots of details I can get into. But, it was about an hour after all that where I had to go into a family room and just share with my girls that their mommy was gone, that she was in heaven, that she had left this world, her body was still here, but that her soul was in eternity. And that was the moment for me where I decided to own my entire story, to make sense of my story, because I think it was desperation. I needed to make sense. I needed them to make sense of theirs. And so I remember going into that room, and I was so thankful to have my spiritual mentor, spiritual father, Tony Evans, there. He was Wynter's uncle. Tony Evans, he was Wynter's uncle, and he was my girl's great uncle, and had really adopted us when we got to Dallas. And I'd worked with the family for about 10 different years in different capacities. And anyway, he was in the room, but I just decided to own my story so that my girls could make sense of theirs. And so I'll never forget going into the room and just them asking what's going on and what's happening, and me just saying, Mommy went to be with Jesus. And I didn't have a lot of other words for them because there was not much else I could say that was true. Now remember, Philippians 4:8, and I wasn't thinking about this in the moment, whatever is true and right and honorable and pure and lovely and admirable and excellent or praiseworthy, think on these things. There was literally nothing else in my life in that moment that was true or praiseworthy or honorable or pure or lovely that I could think of. And so it's just really interesting how this life works when you think about it. I know most of us don't want to think about eternity. We don't want to think about life beyond this life because it's too much to think about. But in that moment, I had no choice but to think about that. And, I have these 4 little girls standing there looking at me with desperate eyes, trying to understand what's happening. And the most true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable and excellent thing I could think of is that their mom was now with Jesus. And 2 things can be true at once. It can be true that Wynter went home to be with Jesus and is living in all of the glory and all of the beauty of eternity that we believe as Christians there is. And we can be left with the absolute sting of death, which is what we were feeling in that moment. But it's really interesting because in that moment, that's the only thing I could have cared to know, or the only thing I could do. And so I just remember telling my girls that and just getting down on my knees and embracing them. And then the only other thing I knew to do was to worship. So I just began to sing, "You're a good, good Father. That's who you are. That's who you are. That's who you are. And I'm loved by you. That's who I am. That's who I am. That's who I am. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us." The only thing that I knew to do with my girls in that moment is to remind them that God is perfect in everything, even when we don't see it, even when we don't feel it, and that He's good, even when we don't see it, and even when we don't feel it. And so, yeah, it was in that moment I just decided to own my story. It wasn't something that I was consciously doing. It was honestly, for me, the thing that I'm most grateful for is in that moment, it actually helped me make sense of my faith in a different way. For all these years, I grew up in a Christian home, little sleepy South Jersey town that I grew up in. My parents were leaders in my church, and I grew up. I would say there's not a day where I didn't know the Lord. That my parents force fed me the gospel. I tasted and saw that God was good. As Scripture says, "Taste and see that He is good." I did that by nature of my parents force feeding the gospel to me, and so when it came to a point where I had to choose. I tasted what God had to offer, and I tasted what the world had to offer, and God always tasted better. And so, I've got this long, boring kind of story with God that doesn't have a lot of exciting peaks and valleys. It was just pretty consistent. And so, one of the things that happened in that is I wasn't exactly sure what would happen when my faith was really tested. And what's beautiful for me is when my faith was tested the most, I realized the depth of, I think, just the trust I had in God in that moment, the desperation I had for Him in that moment. And so all I could do was convey that to my girls, to give that to them. And that was actually me making sense of my story. It was me owning my story. It was me believing what I knew to be true. And I think in that moment, giving my girls at least enough security, because I owned my story, giving them enough security at least to make it through that night and make it through that week and make it through that month and make it through that quarter and make it through that year and make it through to where we are now, 2 years in. It was really in that moment where I had to just make a simple choice to, I guess, just see beyond what I could actually see. There's a quote by my mentor, Tony Evans. He says, "If all you see is what you see, you will never see all there is to be seen." I love that quote. I've heard him say it hundreds of times. If all you see is what you see, you will not see all there is to be seen. And that was obviously a moment in my life where there were some things that I believed to be true that I couldn't see, and I had to choose to believe them to be true by faith. I had to just choose to trust by faith that Wynter was in eternity and that somehow, some way in the cosmos, God could provide for my girls beyond their time with their mom for the short amount of time they had. My oldest daughter at the time, Alina, was 14. My second daughter, Caitlin, was 10, I think, and my twins were 9 at the time, I think. So it's just, I had to believe, I had to trust by faith that God could work all things together for good, which is a scripture that, a lot of us know, that God can work all things together for good. And so I had to believe, I had to see beyond what I could actually see. And that actually requires facing full reality, like I said before, like not limiting your reality to what you see. So when Paul says whatever is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable and excellent, to think on those things, oftentimes you're having to do that beyond what you see or what you feel in that moment, beyond your circumstances. And I think about, it's so funny because I think about, and I'll talk more about just some of the things that God has done in my life, but when I think about what people think about my story and what my life looks like, most people would think, he's a single dad, he's a widow, he's probably really lonely, he's probably depressed, and he's probably sad. And every one of those things is either true or was true. I am a single dad. I am a widow, which is always weird to say. I have had lonely moments, and I have had depressed moments, and I've had really sad moments. I've had lots of moments. But the truth be told, I've watched God do incredible miracles in my life. I actually don't tell anybody, but I got a tattoo on my back that says, Psalms 34:7 says the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear Him, and He rescues them. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear Him, and He rescues them. And it's really interesting because I'm looking back now a couple of years in, and I watched God, despite the difficulty of my circumstances, despite all that was happening in my life at that time. I mean, we moved to a new state. My girl started a new school. I started working at a new church. My girl started going to a new church. Like, our entire community changed. And actually the biggest step, because we moved a couple days before, or 2 weeks before Wynter passed away, and we would come back maybe about 10 days after her funeral. But it was a big risk, and I could not see where we were going to go, what we were going to do, how we were going to be provided for. And what's crazy is I had to see beyond what I could actually see. I had to believe by faith that God knew what He was doing. He could work all things together for good. And so what most people assume about my life is true. I'm a single dad. I'm a widow. I've had lonely moments. I've had depressed moments. I've had really sad moments. But what also is true is that God has surrounded me with his angels, both, I believe, literal and figurative. He surrounded me. He surrounded my girls. My girls have more friendships than they had even when we were in Dallas for all those years. And like God made up for all that they lost. Incredible teachers, an incredible school. Our church, I can't even begin, or I'll try to in this podcast, begin to explain to you what the body of Christ did for us in those moments, how they surrounded us. What's funny is if I would have decided to not leave Dallas and stay there out of comfort or out of fear, then we would have missed out on what God was planning all along that we couldn't see. So if all I saw was what I could see, I would never see all there is to be seen. And so I'm looking at it now and just really thankful to see what God has done in my life. I continue just to choose to believe what is honorable, right, pure, true, lovely, admirable, to think about those things, because it's in thinking about those things that you can actually live above the circumstances that you're actually in right now. So I want to ask you a question, and I guess I just want to ask you, will you take the time to make sense of your story? Not just the parts you like, not just the parts that are really attractive and fun, but even the parts that maybe are traumatic, or the parts that you've tried to stuff down well below the surface of your life. Maybe it's owning your parenting journey, and parenting's really difficult right now. Whatever it is, I guess I want to ask you, will you choose to make sense of your own story? One, so that you can just find God's goodness in the middle of it, regardless of what it feels like. But two, that you can help others around you, specifically your children, if you have children, but also those that God has called you to be your spiritual children, those that you're helping along on their journey so they can make sense of their story as well. Because you owning your story, you making sense of your story, you leaning into your story, you seeing what's right, honorable, pure, lovely, true, admirable, excellent, praiseworthy. I always mess the order up, but you deciding to see those things because they are there and present. You doing that is not only going to help you, but it's going to help somebody else. So will you own that? Right after Wynter's 40th birthday, which would have been a year and a half after she passed away, I had the opportunity to teach at my church because a couple other pastors got sick with the flu. And so I got the call, and we were already in a series on spiritual disciplines. And one of the spiritual disciplines that came up that happened to be that week was one I'd never heard of, which is the discipline of celebration. And it's actually a lot based on Philippians 4. And you've got Paul that says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice." And then he goes on to say, "Whatever is true and right and honorable and pure and lovely and admirable and excellent and praiseworthy, think about these things." The discipline of celebration is choosing to lean into joy regardless of your circumstances. Paul's saying this to a church in Philippi that is literally being tortured. Their people are being martyred and disenfranchised for their faith. And he's saying in the middle of all that, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Like in the middle of your circumstances, rejoice. Like it's not like a request, it's like a command. And then he says, whatever is true and right and honorable and pure and lovely and admirable and excellent or praiseworthy, to think about these things. Because like I'm saying right now, and like I've actually learned from Paul as I've put these things into practice, regardless of your circumstances, those things exist. There's always something that's true and right and honorable and pure and lovely and excellent and praiseworthy. I'm saying these things over and over again because I want to just like really reassure you in your mind, no matter what you're feeling right now, no matter where you are right now, like they exist. And to dwell on those things, to think on those things is going to put your heart and your spirit and your mind in a better place than dwelling on the others. The other things exist. Wynter died. I was there. My girls were there. It was awful. It was the worst circumstance of my life, the worst thing I've ever walked through. And the worst circumstance of my life and the worst thing I've ever walked through, the worst part of my journey to date, God was present. He was there. And he gave me some things to dwell on that were much richer and much more inspiring than the things that I could have dwelled on. And I've had those moments too. We'll talk about those. I'm not going to just leave you thinking that I'm like this perfect pastor that just grieves so well and shepherds his girl so well and, does change management so well. I've had a lot of moments that I've not done so well. And we'll talk about some of that. But I don't know. I just want you to own your story, all of it, the good, the bad, the ugly. And as you're owning it, I want you to think about the things that will actually benefit you along the way. So glad to have you join me on this first podcast. Grateful just to be able to share, and I'm going to share a lot more, and I look forward to those moments.